everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Bertha Centre webinar on a Friday at lunchtime. This is our brown bag series. This is part 5, and we really look forward to hearing from Zeenat Hendricks today, who's doing her MPhil in Inclusive Innovation, and she's also a Bertha Centre scholar. And her research is exploring inclusive communications as a tool for social innovation from the inside out. I'm Diana Ochola, Bertha Centre Marketing Communications Manager, and I'll be chairing the session today. If you have any questions during Zeenat's presentation, please feel free to drop it in the chat or can do the Q&A at the end. A little bit more about Zeenat is over the last few years, Zeenat has been working in the profit sector and has observed the rates at which civil society organizations have to deal with constant change and challenges in the sector. This has drawn her closer to innovation and a need to want to further her understanding of inclusive innovation and its benefits for communities and beyond. Really excited to hear your presentation, Zeenat. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Great. Okay, so as Diana mentioned, I'm Zeenat Hendricks, and I will take you through an overview of my research journey so far, and just to also say these are all sort of early findings and research notes and observations. So firstly, a bit of an introduction and context to my work. I've sort of focused on 2 ways of introduction, and that is myself as a communications practitioner and the journey so far. I've been in the nonprofit space for about 9 years, and a large part of my research work has been influenced by my practice work. And so it's a lot of observations about the ways we do communication in our organizations and how we include people in building strategy. And number 2, sort of the second part of this journey is around me being an insider researcher. And for some context on that, my research site is Rape Crisis Cape Town Trust, and it's also the organization in which I work. And so much of my work is based on what I do at Rape Crisis. And so therefore I've taken this on as, I've taken on the insider role as a researcher. So just to quickly give some background and some information about communication. So traditionally, the role of communications is to create and implement communication strategies. And this is largely, consisting of content generation, social media, digital, your brand, and storytelling. And as a comms practitioner myself, my interest and my curiosity led me to want to explore more ways that subsystems in an organization can be included in strategy, and subsystems would really be, the program staff in an organization. So the opportunity, is the gap and the disconnection I observed between the communications processes and the programmatic work. And that is really something I think that most organizations struggle with, is that siloed way of work. So I started exploring with this idea of inclusive communications, and in literature, it meant, what are we doing to make communications more accessible out there? But in my definition, I've defined inclusive communications as a participative approach to include subsystems of the organization in the communication process. This process creates opportunities for subsystems to contribute for further development of the strategy, thus tapping into existing expertise in a process that is essentially inclusive and accessible. Some of the scholarship and literature that I've looked at mainly has been Hicks, which speaks about the ladder of inclusive innovation, and sort of focuses on 6 levels. And in those 6 levels, I have drawn out just 2, which is level 4 and 5, which is about process and structure. And so that looks at the ways of how inclusive innovation is structured in an organization, and what where does it fall into in terms of all of your processes that you have running. So yeah, I wish to explore this, and see how it develops in organizations. And then the second scholarship, which I'm drawing on, is Nielsen and Paddock, which is focused on social innovation from the inside out, also known as experiential organizing or processes, also known as inscaping. And that looks at the, what are organizations doing that builds the capacity for insiders to innovate. And then on this quadrant over here, defining strategic communication. So I thought it would be useful to also look at communications as a scholarship on its own. And there's a lot of scholarship around what defines communications traditionally in corporates, as well as nonprofit space. And I think that what I've discovered in that is there's a very static way of doing communications and marketing in organizations. And there wasn't really much room for social justice work, and how do we apply comms in that area. And then an area of exploration, which is blank at the moment, is what I am hoping to contribute to and also add in scholarship, just based on what my fieldwork has shown me or what has emerged. So my intention as an insider researcher is to implement change in my organization, promote inclusivity, develop or generate theory that can be useful to organizations that practice communications, and to explore intersections of inclusive comms practices with scholarship. So as mentioned before, really looking at inclusive innovation and how we think about tools that become this, as well as strategic communications and communications for social change. Innovation from the inside out is a scholarship on its own. And what has emerged from my fieldwork in terms of the literature has been something that I still have to, which I'm in the early stages of doing, is joining this with more scholarship on organizational development and dialogue, as well as the theory and practice of innovation and what exists in terms of that. So in terms of methodology, as you would imagine, this is quite a creative process, and communications in organizations generally is the function that's quite agile and is expected to respond quite quickly. So what I had thought is to apply an action research methodology. And so far it's been an incredible exploration of planning and observing and reflecting. So today what I'm really showcasing is a lot of reflections based on my first cycle of research. And so the cycle of research consists of constructing, planning the action, taking action, and evaluating the action. And then I sort of combined that with my first cycle of research. And so my early fieldwork reflections is really a deep dive into communications. And one of the main disciplines of that would be a rebrand. And if you think about a rebrand, traditionally, it would be done just by the comms team or just by an external consultant. And so I've used the rebrand as an action research cycle on its own. And the way I've structured that is that I've combined methods and frameworks to actually create these sessions that speak to the framework of action research. So the action research cycle 1, which consists of constructing, planning, taking action, and evaluating it. And then co-creation, which was actually the style of each session. And then design thinking helps to construct the session and give us ways of facilitating the session in a very inclusive and innovative way in itself. So drawing on design thinking, the first session of co-creation and really inviting staff and members into the space of doing this rebrand was around adopting the mindset and setting the tone and the foundation for what it is that we would want to achieve. And session 2 is about ideation, so really getting people to work and to work in groups and pairs and bring their voice. And session 3 was about building for implementation, which was really around what have we gathered in terms of data for the rebrand, and how will we now put that together as a collective. And then just to sort of manage the process of action research and the project itself, which is the rebrand, I've worked with the spiral of action research cycles, which is looking at, again, like managing and monitoring the cycle of research and constructing, planning, taking action and evaluating, which is a constant process that we've had to do as a facilitation team. So coming back after each session and looking at what did we learn and how can we debrief better, or how can we reflect on the findings or the knowledge that was expressed in the sessions. And some more early fieldwork reflections. From my perspective and my, sort of clear indications of what came out of this was that it had sparked many different conversations about communications as a whole, as well as people relating to the brand and the identity of an organization, the creativity space that we make for things like this, battling with change and the resistance to change and the resistance to innovate, and how people actually feel about participation and inclusion in processes in an organization. So participating could be seen as something that is easy for people, but how they contribute their voice to processes, or how much of that is included in the project's journey. So this sort of touched on, this emerged out of all of the sessions, in fact, that everybody sort of had a lot of feelings and I guess input around experiential learning, which is stuff that they've learned in the sessions, and how this process could increase the capacity of the organization to be innovative. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really informative presentation. I'm wondering, if anyone would like to jump in with any questions, you're welcome to, while we give a moment for those attending to give it a think. I have a question regarding fieldwork. Just curious in general, what challenges and highlights you experienced during that specific process?
During that process, the challenges I experienced was being an insider and navigating my way as both an insider researcher as well as the practitioner work. So balancing that, and also then structuring the sessions for my research work. And so I think in combination with that, the highlight would be that I formulated a co-research team of facilitators that had made this process a little bit more, I'd say, easier, and how they came on board was quite organic, in the sense that they each took a role in facilitating and debriefing and running the session. So it wasn't just me leading the space. In fact, I wasn't supposed to lead much of the process, but I was just meant to observe. So at some point I was leading, at some point I was observing. So it helped to have people like our M&E specialist, a digital officer, even the graphic designer himself in the sessions, to observe what was being said and created in these sessions. So that was definitely a highlight, is the way in which this organically came together, from a core project to a research project in the organization.
And also curious about action research as a methodology, because from my understanding, you go into the research quite open-ended, and the process sort of defines where it's going. So I guess the question there is, how did you navigate that? Because I don't know if you maybe have different expectations based on where you started and then where you ended. So just curious to hear your thoughts around that, navigating that space.
Yeah, so I definitely had expectations. I mean, I think all researchers have the idea of expectations and findings. And I think what was like beautiful about the process is that I knew that I was just going to wait for a project to almost emerge in the organization. And that was when I was going to sort of apply my mind and do the work. But then the rebrand was birthed out of the organization's sort of current status in terms of transitioning and new leadership and adjusting to an external environment that's constantly changing. And what about communications was leading that. And a lot of the times we were reflecting as an organization and going like, actually, communications is leading a lot of innovative processes. We're not calling it innovation and we're not calling it inclusive, but we are doing it. So we've got all of this action happening all the time already in the organization, but how are we capturing this? And how is it becoming, research work that can be joined sort of with scholarship? And that was the moment where I realized, well, this is a great time to start something and start observing. So it naturally emerged in that way.
We've got a question from Tombini. Are you able to identify any ways that the culture of a nonprofit had an impact on the trends that you observed?
Thank you, Ntombini, for your question. I can definitely answer that question. I guess because I'm an insider, I can say this because I've experienced it. And there was obviously a lot of concern and resistance from the organization. And I would put that down as culture. The culture of an organization is one of a growth mindset, or one of a little bit like needs time to process certain movements in the organization that might be a little bit futuristic. And when we bring up things like rebranding in an organization that is in existence for such a long time and plays a very vital role in the communities that we serve, there were things raised like, how are people going to now see us? Are we changing? Will they remember who we are? Will they still be able to identify us? And I think that a lot of that had to do with certain, I guess, the way the organization is being run and how people are either joined in those processes or not. And so what really helped was a very clear understanding and rationale behind the research project firstly, and then the core project itself, which is about change and which is about having something new take place and the capacity to grow. So there were challenges involved in that. And I definitely think that in the nonprofit space, we make changes to our look and feel. We try rigorous communication strategies, but I think we don't always succeed in that because there's that disconnection with what we're doing in the world and how we're doing it inside our organization. But I'm hoping that a lot of this work can be transferable, and it's not only in the NGO space, but I'm sure that it also exists in other spaces and institutions as well. So having a culture that is dynamic and sort of, I'd say, agile, progressive, and creative. Creative is a very big principle of this process. Anybody can be a part of it, and anybody should feel like they can, and that definitely contributes to the culture of making this a project that I can say now was achievable.
And I have, there's another question. Yes, Ntombini says yes, it does. And you mentioned in our conversation earlier how you are currently in a transition to another position. And so wondering how that would also influence you in your research going forward.
Yes, so my transition is into a new space, and it's also still within the communications and engagement space. But how that affects this process. And I thought to myself that perhaps leaving this space as an insider now will change my perspective on my observations a little bit in a better way, actually. So I'm geared to write up my findings. But I think it also leaves room for others to start innovating themselves. I feel that in organizations, often innovation is one person's job, and that pressure is on just that specific person or team. And I want to say that it actually needs to be a collective that takes responsibility for change in an organization, that takes responsibility for questioning when is it time to do something different, when is it time to create the room and space for processes. It shouldn't just be leadership and management that gives you the go-ahead for innovation. It should be a process that is from the groundswell. So for me, I feel confident that making this move outside of the organization will, in fact, steer on innovation even more. Yeah.
I love that so much, especially like activity coming from within the organization, not necessarily from the top, because that has greater chance of creating sustainability of that change, right? And I think it sounds like maybe, at least within your role at Rape Crisis, you planted a seed of we as a team can innovate from within. That's that's very inspiring.
And I think joining the two of the scholarship around innovation from the inside out is really about the inner experiences of members in an organization, be that staff, volunteers, board members, whoever it is. But it briefly mentions as well that if we don't capacitate people in organizations to innovate, then it kind of just leaves us with no tools to do so. I may be onto something with communications, but it could be any other project that could also do this in an organization.
But maybe just as a wrap up, what next? When are you aiming to submit? Yeah, what's it feeling like right now?
It's feeling like a lot of work that I still need to do. What I presented is sort of very early stages and early findings. And I'm aiming to wrap up by the end of this year. Yeah, that's the deadline for myself.
Well, we wish you all the best for the rest of this journey. And in a wrap-up email, I'll share with everyone that attended Zeenat's email address as well, if you'd like to get in touch with her, as well as a recording and her actual PowerPoint presentation. But otherwise, thank you. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Zeenat.
Thank you.